Hi, and welcome to the Nonprofit Matters podcast, brought to you by #Nonprofit, the show where we tackle real, complex, and often unspoken challenges of working in South Africa's nonprofit sector. From ethical dilemmas and leadership struggles, to funding cuts, legal hurdles, and burnout, this is a space for honest conversation about what it really takes to keep doing good. This podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of the LV and Ivy Middleton Charitable Trust. We're grateful for their partnership in helping us create a platform where the sector can reflect, share, and find new ways forward.
I'm Clara Kwizera, your host for today's episode, and I'm the South African country manager for a nonprofit organization called iZinga Assist. And I'm so thrilled to guide you through this critical conversation on the impact of international funding cuts on South African nonprofit organizations. Joining me today are three incredible powerhouse women who bring deep expertise and lived experience to this topic. First, we have Audrey Elster, Executive Director of the Raith Foundation, Nyasha and Njela, Director of Revolutionise International, and Louise Driver, Executive Director of the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa. Ladies, I'm going to ask each of you to do a quick introduction on yourself, please, and tell us a quirky habit or fun fact about yourself that most people don't know. Audrey, welcome, and I'll hand over to you to kick it off.
Great to be here. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to the chat. And yes, I'm Audrey Elster. I have been the Executive Director of the Raith Foundation for the last 17 years. And we are a funder, South African funder in the social justice space. Quirky fact, fun. I'm not very much fun, I don't think, actually, but I am a sports fanatic. From everything from golf to baseball, I know it all. But I do draw the line at Formula One.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Audrey. And Nyasha, welcome.
Thank you. This is such an important topic to be speaking about at the moment. My name is Nyasha and Njela. I am a director at Revolutionise International. We accelerate organizations with purpose. And a quirky, fun fact about me is I have two series that I constantly go back to, and I can't get enough of watching them, and that's Big Bang Theory and Friends.
Great choices. Brilliant choices. Thanks, Nyasha. Louise, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Clara. So I'm the Executive Director of the Independent Philanthropy Association South Africa, and we're a membership network of private foundations investing in South Africa. And I've been in this position for about 6.5 years, but I've been in the philanthropy world ever since I was 12 years old. And that was inspired by a project I did on Mother Teresa. And the quirky fact was I then traveled around the world and spent time working for Mother Teresa in Kolkata. So it was great further inspiration for me in my work.
That is beautiful. What a beautiful experience. Thank you for sharing that, Louise. And thank you to all the ladies for those introductions. It's clear that we have a rich mix of perspectives and experience in the room, and that's exactly what we need for this conversation. So, ladies, we are all aware that international funding cuts are affecting nonprofit organizations in South Africa in really real and tangible ways, whether it's from the threats on the sustainability of their programs, to staffing cuts, and of course the overall long-term impact of the crucial work that these NPOs are doing. The USAID and PEPFAR funding cuts have really made us realize just how fragile our entire funding model is. Nonprofit organizations are constantly being told, explore other alternatives. What are long-term income sources, impact investing, local philanthropy? And it can all be quite overwhelming. So, Audrey, I would like for you to kick us off here. Is it time for South African nonprofits to completely rethink how we are funded? And what would this kind of funding model even look like?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is time. Completely rethink might be a bit of a stretch, but I do think we need to rethink. And I understand that it is overwhelming, but I do also think that the best approach to feeling overwhelmed, which we've all experienced, is to make a plan. Either scenario planning, and then to just start doing, to just launch in. And it is scary though. But I think, we all know now that it's clear that we should have started thinking about this and doing this a long time ago. And hindsight is, 2020. And some people have, and some of it has been done, and they were not starting from nothing. We just need to intensify and expand and be creative, of course, ultimately. But, I think if we look back at foreign funding models, we can see, either philanthropic or bilateral, that we've been in crisis for a while. As far back as 2010, we can remember that certainly in our space, that we knew we couldn't depend on foreign funding. Already big funders like Atlantic Philanthropies at the time, huge funder in the social justice space, suddenly withdrew funding, leaving the sector quite shattered actually for a while. And more recently, we've seen European government funding drying up little by little, a little bit more incrementally, because of immigration or so-called, threats and war in Ukraine. And so the signs have been there. And I think we haven't looked that straight in the face and said, okay, this is going to continue or it's going to get worse and we need to do something. And now, of course, it's gotten dramatically worse with the US government's position, not only on South Africa, but on social justice work in general from their point of view. My feeling has always been that actually South Africa does not need to be dependent on foreign funding, South Africa at least, because we can fund this work ourselves. And so how can we fund this work? I mean, I think, Clara, you already mentioned the various alternatives that are out there that we haven't really tried at scale. And that's in addition to grant funding. I don't think we need to replace it all wholesale. Incrementally we can maybe, but grant funding is there and will be there. But like any funding and any fundraising, you need diversification always. And in this case, as you noted, it can come from a range of sources here. Individual giving. South Africa has a large middle class. It has a large community philanthropy. Local philanthropy foundations are still an option for expansion. There's business here, which is already giving. And then, of course, some NGOs, depending on what they do, can charge fees for services. But I think, we can still do more to improve giving infrastructure. I read yesterday, I don't know if anyone else read this in Alliance, that in Mauritius, companies are required to set aside 2% of their profits to fund the not-for-profit sector. I mean, that's absolutely huge. And Mauritius is obviously a different kettle of fish, but we don't need to aim that high. But I do think there's more the government can do and should do to make giving easier, either for corporates or for individuals, and make it easier for the NGOs to earn money themselves. So I think infrastructure, we need to work on that. All of these options, of course, require a different approach to fundraising. I think NGOs have looked outwards for money. They need to start looking inwards. Their work needs to be totally rooted in local, even regional issues first. And then more sophisticated approaches to communication is going to be necessary because it needs to be messaging that's rooted in local constituencies. And it may require a different approach to implementation because I think we're looking at different ways of being now. I think that implementation needs to be based on collaboration and an assessment of your structure, whether that is still fit for purpose. and an exploration of shared service options, all sorts of different modus operandi. But I think there's no doubt in the short term it'll be difficult to replace foreign funding, and the quantum of money may never be the same, but I do believe it's possible.
That's a brilliant answer, Audrey. Thank you so much. And maybe Louise and Nyasha, when Audrey mentioned, how NPOs really need to start looking inward, I saw a strong nod from you on that one. I just want to check if there's anything else you want to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Audrey said. And I think it's important to take this as an opportunity as well within our sector. An opportunity to build African philanthropy. And of course, not all organizations can automatically start a social enterprise. So that kind of rethink needs to be intentional and have leadership and board buy-in. And then when it comes to diversification of income, this is a behavior, not a strategy. I think it's important to state that it's a behavior of the organization and not a strategy. So it actually requires culture shifts within the organization and how the organization sees money and their mission.
That is powerful, powerful words. Thank you, Nyasha. Louise, is there anything you would like to add to that? I mean, from your perspective and your experience.
Yeah, as we said, it's. I think there's been a lot of talk about the reliance on global North funding for years among the nonprofit sector, but yet little has been done to actually reduce that reliance. So this was obviously a shock to everyone, but almost forcing them to do to walk the talk, which we've been talking about for years. So I think that is one point we have to grow, reduce our reliance on foreign aid, increase the funding from local sources. But it also is a lesson, I think, for the nonprofit sector and the funding sector that one has to prepare for crises. One has to be in these escalating, changing times where there's huge uncertainty. One has to have systems, processes in place in order to be able to respond effectively to crises.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much, Louise. Heading over to you, Nyasha. We've heard from many nonprofit organizations that funding applications are becoming increasingly burdensome. Full of buzzwords, everyone wants the latest tech and platforms, all the donors want the latest tech and platforms and nonprofits to be using these. And it feels like expectations are somewhat, disconnected from the realities on the ground. Meanwhile, I feel a lot of nonprofits are feeling quite frustrated right now because, they are tried and tested models. Organizations have been running these programs for years. They are changing lives, yet these organizations still seem to be overlooked. Is there a way that NPOs can start pushing back on donor expectations that don't necessarily reflect the true context and the true value of the work that they are already doing? And how do we sort of provide this bridge between NPOs and donors so that they can meet in the middle and understand the challenges that each of them are facing?
If I had one rant for every time I've heard that question, I'll probably be a rich woman at the present moment. And this frustration comes in daily with the organizations that I work with. The application treadmill is exhausting. And it does feel like a treadmill. It feels like organizations need to distort the truth, and it's turning everyone to look at their programs quite differently. And sometimes they're looking at innovation, tech-driven work, and just to tick a box. But the first thing that I would say is organizations need to go back to their why and their purpose. So bring in the purpose and let that be your anchor. Part of the reason why we end up chasing trends is that we've lost sight of our purpose. Many organizations have followed funder needs, and for so long, their own story is so blurred. They bend, they adapt, they stretch, and this leads them to have mission drift, and it starts setting in. So the first start of pushing back to funders is know your purpose, know your why, and know who you are as an organization. Once you're grounded in that, you can identify the funders who should be walking alongside you. And then The other thing that I can say is that the second thing would be reframe what innovation actually means. Because when you start from the ground up and you start working with communities in looking at what innovation actually means in communities, speak to your beneficiaries as organizations. Take your funders to speak to the beneficiaries so that they can learn and know what innovation actually means in the spaces that we're working in the context that we're working in. And being rooted in your purpose also gives the confidence to say, this is what works actually when it comes to innovation. And if you want to work alongside us, we make no apology of that this is what innovation looks like. And sometimes innovation doesn't look the same as everyone. AI illusions come in, but maybe what someone actually just needs is an SMS, not a WhatsApp, not an email. They don't need that. They need an SMS. And that's what innovation means to them. So push back with your purpose and the evidence that you can bring in. And that evidence starts from ground up, starts from you understanding your communities. So building our programs needs to start from the community base. And sometimes what we've done is we've bended so many times when it comes to funders that we're just chasing and we're prospecting and we're chasing. And if a funder says we want to operate in this space, then we decide to go in that space. And we're not listening to our beneficiaries. We're not listening to the people that we're serving. And I would encourage that we all collectively advocate for things. So collective advocacy is going to save us in this particular space. Build those networks, alliances, not just alliances with other civil society organizations, but alliances with donors as well. Have those bodies. And then finally, what I would say is the purpose is the antidote to drift. Trend chasing is exhausting. If we're rooted in our why, we'll always know how to frame our work, which funders to engage, and when to say, this is enough. This is us. And we're out.
Nyasha, I think that is so critical what you've said, and it specifically in terms around NPOs understanding what their purpose is and sticking to that. And just to share a little bit from our experience at iZinga, assisting nonprofits in terms of their verification process, one of the questions we ask is, can you share your theory of change? And we've seen how a lot of nonprofits are really struggling to sort of understand this concept of their theory of change, how it drives their mission, how it drives everything that they do, and then how it enables them to provide, that impact and reporting and the outcomes to donors. So, Louise, Audrey, I'm wondering, from a donor perspective, do you see donors supporting NPOs around their theory of change, or what do donors ask for when it comes to the purpose of NPOs? Are they aligning it to what their strategic sort of considerations are, or are they aligning it to what the needs are out there?
I mean,
do you want to go, Louise?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to speak in a more general perspective, and Audrey can speak from a foundation perspective. I don't think there's one fits all, Clara. I think every founder, at the moment we're working with 70 different foundations at IPASA, and they all work very differently. So some have very, very kind of deep key performance indicators, theories of change, measurement tools, and the way they work with their nonprofit implementation partners and the projects and programs they fund. And others work a much more trust-based philanthropy approach where the community comes with them, says what they need, let the community come up with the what they define the problem is, what they think the solution is, and fund them in that way. So my answer is that there's a whole range of them. And obviously the bigger funders need to be they have more stricter requirements just because of the nature of their organizations.
Thanks, Louise.
Yeah, I mean, as a funder, I always feel terribly guilty at any requirements that we ask of already overburdened. It's very obvious to me, having been in the NGO sector, how overburdened the NGO sector is. But I think, as Louise says, unfortunately, we also have constraints as donors, so I would like to be a different type of donor, but unfortunately, I think that would cost us more to do. So it's a balancing act. We look at the needs, definitely. We spend quite a lot of time on that. And then we look at, from the needs, what should our strategy be and what is the strategy of the grantee that we're thinking of funding.
I mean, I really just agree with Nyasha in terms of the need for organizations to stick not rigidly to purpose, but I think if you don't stick to purpose, it's going to lead you down the path of disintegration, actually. And I do also agree that collective advocacy in terms of pushing back to donors is absolutely essential. I know it's easier said than done, and it takes a brave person to, put their toe in the water there because there's fear of being defunded, not funded, etc. But as a donor myself, I know from experience that we at least are very open to people saying, we don't understand what you mean. Can you do a session on theories of change, for example? If you want a theory of change, can you help us with a theory of change? And I think people need to understand that it's a two-way business, this. I need effective NGOs who are targeting the problems in communities and helping and working with communities. And they need the money. So let's work together, to make this happen. And I think there's more room, there's more wiggle room. There's a little bit of room for negotiation on some things, and there's more room for negotiation on others. But you need to have those conversations with donors. And some I know are more open to that. Some are more rigid than others. But it's worth, trying. Because pushback can be very effective, actually, and teaching donors, because some just don't really understand that perspective. They've never worked for an NGO. They don't know what it's like. They don't know how difficult it is. They don't know what it means to be writing 30 proposals at the same time and reporting on them all and juggling your budget to fit it all into different donor requirements. So, yeah, I would say communication, negotiation, but and framing, as Nyasha said. There's lots of space for framing.
Coming to you, Louise, we've heard comparisons between recent USAID cuts and, funding shifts that happened during COVID, where funding support shifted to immediate crisis sort of response around healthcare, hunger relief, etc. Well, that is extremely understandable. And, the need was dire at the time. It's left a lot of nonprofits, nonprofit organizations who are doing more longer term work. So maybe working in the education space or climate change. They're feeling a bit sidelined. So from a funder perspective, what did you see in terms of crisis response during COVID? And how does that differ to how local philanthropy is responding to the cuts in USAID and PEPFAR funding, with particular sort of focus around, the needs for HIV and healthcare treatments? Are funders sticking to these mandates, or are they shifting to the current needs?
Thanks, Clara. Yeah, so IPASA was very involved with the onset of COVID, and it's been a very different experience from the US impact, the impact of the US funding crisis. So with COVID, it was a very quick response. It was considered a crisis. And funders, particularly our members, joined together collaboratively to say, how do we address the food security crisis? How do we address the closing of the schools? How do we address the universities? And funders within their funding focus areas collaborated together with other key stakeholders, and really were coming up with solutions with funding. It was a real great example of multi-stakeholder collaboration. I don't think not many organizations suffered during COVID, because it was every organization was experiencing. So funders continued funding within their area of their fund focus area, which was all impacted by COVID. Yes, a funding crisis is a very different situation. Historically, private philanthropy in South Africa very little of private philanthropy in South Africa has funded healthcare. The reason why is because all our healthcare needs in this country have been met with global funding, USAID, PEPFAR, Clinton Health Initiative, you name it. And so private philanthropy has funded other areas where they are more needed. The government has worked very closely with these big global philanthropies on health. So now suddenly the local philanthropies are being called in to support the organizations impacted by the funding crisis. But it's very difficult for them because many of them healthcare isn't their area. And they haven't ever been asked to get involved much before, other than maybe providing, during COVID vaccines. But that's so it's a very difficult situation. Also, COVID was seen as a crisis. The withdrawal of the US funding is seen not as a crisis. It's not a short-term effect. It's seen as a long-term systemic change. That funding's not coming back. Everyone knows it. And so a crisis allows an emergency response. A long-term systemic change needs a lot more thought. And so we've seen a very slow response to local philanthropy to this crisis. How should the nonprofit sector react? And I'm talking about those now, particularly in the healthcare space, although we have seen education nonprofits, youth employment nonprofits, universities. We've seen this funding crisis affect much more than just healthcare. Social justice organizations, all impacted by this. There needs to be a coordinated effort by the nonprofit sector to actually get funding towards addressing these issues. At the moment, there's a very fragmented approach. And I met with 3 of our funders who are big, and they want to put a lot of money into this, but they're saying they need a solution, and one nonprofit can't provide the solution. They need 10 of them working in the area to come together with a solution. So that is a problem. Is there's not a coordinated impact, but with the nonprofits. There also is the need to look at the cross-sectionality of issues, the intersectionality. Okay, for example, climate. Some people said, "Well, we don't fund climate," but climate intersects almost every funding focus area you work in or you fund. The same with gender, the same with social justice. It is, so it's to look at that lens which crosses across any area that you're working in, and bringing out that idea, that way of thinking in order to get the right funding for your project, or get the right funders on board. As a nonprofit organization, our experience being recipient of funding from the US is that our US funders have been incredible, that they've paid us early. They've paid us 2 years in 1 year because they've recognized crisis. They've recognized that the money is needed now. And so there has been some there's been some forward-thinking funders who've said, "This is a crisis situation. Here's the money up front. We trust that you're going to deal with this crisis." And so in that way, it does mirror a little bit of the COVID response, where a lot of funders changed their restricted funding to unrestricted, and said, use it as you see best in order to address the situation due to very exceptional circumstances.
Thanks so much, Louise. And I think you've made a very critical point there, particularly around, sort of defining or distinguishing between what happened during COVID and what is happening now. And I think you sort of phrased it as COVID was a crisis. It was a health crisis. It was a pandemic. And, the response just came flooding in. Whereas in terms of the USAID funding cuts, it is a long-term systemic change. And that is quite scary. The fact that perhaps maybe people aren't seeing that as a crisis, which it is very much so for the non-profit organizations in South Africa. And this might be a bit too controversial for this podcast, so please cut it if you need to. But I love what you were saying about how some of your funders are coming together and they're willing to fund this and we can put money together, but they want a solution. It's the same thing that Elon Musk has been saying. He will donate all of his billions and billions when someone gives him a blueprint that works. Is it fair for these people with this power and these resources to just be shoving that on the NPOs and saying, well, come with the solution, when that really requires research, which we know is very expensive to do thorough research and to get the sort of data and insights that these funders would need. But yeah, I guess, Nyasha, Audrey, just moving on to you and your thoughts around that, and maybe any advice that you could give nonprofit organizations who aren't working in the sort of crisis relief side, but are working on long-term systemic issues that need constant support.
I mean, it's a very complex issue. There's no simple answer to this. There is a quantum issue, I think. When I look at it as a local funder, it's overwhelming. So you think, okay, $7 billion is needed. I can't even get my head around that. And I do think, we are equally overwhelmed. Donors, we're all overwhelmed, which, as I said, is not helpful. And I do think, we've been trying to practice as donors responding to, the needs that come from, and not dictate how things should be done. And so in this case, I think there is a bit of that. There's a kind of like, we're waiting, for the NGO sector to come together. I do think the government is also missing in action, in terms of helping to us to see as donors where we can be most useful, where we can plug certain gaps depending on how much money we have available. So I think we're all a bit stunned, actually. I think I understand the NGO sector is overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed. The government is overwhelmed. And again, I think, as has been said many times, it is about collective, collaborative action, coming together, pulling together. We would pull together to support research. We can't do it, obviously, ourselves. That's huge. But just to give you an example, we fund about 3 or 4 different health NGOs. They've come to us separately to fund research. And we say, you need to collaborate on this, at least for your part of that work, and we don't get it. So, yeah, I think there's the multiple challenges here in terms of how to go forward. But inaction, of course, is not an option. And I'm glad to hear that the international foundations that have access to much larger sums of money are pulling together, because I think they can definitely make the big impact. And we, as a local philanthropy, have, as before, supplemented that in the ways that is most strategic.
From my side, I think one of the biggest things is because I work across continents and I work across the continent of Africa, the one thing that I will say from a South African point of view is there is a privilege within South Africa in the sense that philanthropy is incentivized in some ways. So therefore it's open, right? It's much more open. The devastating effects of all of this have hit our other counterparts on the continent a lot more, because legislatively there's nothing that actually incentivizes philanthropy. I also want to commend the corporate sector and the funding sector within South Africa. Funders in South Africa have actually stepped up to the best of their ability. And covering 7 billion is a lot. And maybe they may not be able to cover 7 billion, but I've worked with funders that have said there were gaps. We were covering 30%. And so now we have to shift and cover 90% of this project, because we want the outcomes to look good. We want to make sure that the communities are built much better. So I've seen that coming through. On the nonprofit side as well, I've seen people thinking differently around how they can reshape things so that they're able to tap into funding streams that they weren't able to tap into before. But people are not talking to one another. And that's sometimes where the problem lies. We're not talking to one another. And in this crisis moment, we're having pop-up conversations about it, and they just become conversations, but that don't turn into action. So I can understand when the 1% asks for solutions because we're just talking. They are looking for those solutions, and we've got them because we're implementing the programs. We've got the solutions. But because we're not talking to one another, then those solutions are lost somewhere. And we see each other as competitors in this game rather than collaborators.
More powerful words from you, Nyasha. Thank you so much for that. And I think a clear theme that is coming through in this conversation is that dire need for the sector to really collaborate. I think we've been hearing collaboration, and people have been saying it's a buzzword in the sector for many years, and we've attended lots of conferences and workshops, but how do we make it happen now? What are the next steps, the physical actions that we can take to get things moving in the right direction?
Clara,
Louise?
Can I come in here and just say, because we're speaking about the lack of a fragmented approach by the nonprofit sector, and we have seen at IPASA, the 10 years of our being, how funder collaboration has really increased through having a sector body, for the lack of a better word, for our association. It really does. And yet there isn't a non-profit sector body. And I think if there was an organization like that, it would really help grow collaboration in the non-profit sector.
100%. I think the first struggle is getting a regulatory body in the sector. And then hopefully once we have that, or that could, sort of play that role as well. But ladies, I think this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for your perspectives. I'm going to ask each one of you to share your final thoughts and advice that you would give to NPOs, and maybe share a resource or a book or podcast, something that has inspired you recently in terms of your work that you could share with our audience.
I think I would just reinforce repeat. It's kind of, I don't want to simplify it, but I do think there are at least 5 C's in this that have jumped out of this conversation. Right? One of them is community. Keeping a focus on your community. Who are you working with? Who is important? Who are you trying to kind of serve? Community, I think, is at the center of this. And they, of course, we know are the ones who will suffer from this cut in this crisis. I think also we need to be calm. It's hard to not panic, actually, but calm. We need to be calm and clear thinking. And I think, what donors can do is actually convene. That is a power that we definitely have. And we have been convening a lot of conversations, and it does feel a little bit like a lot of talking, but I think through talking, we are getting some clarity. There's another C. And I think, as we've said before, I would just reinforce, collaboration has been a bit of a buzzword, but I also like collective action, because I think collective action by donors, collective action by NGOs, it strengthens us all. It's not easy, which is why it's not done enough, but it definitely is the future. Yep.
Nyasha?
For me, there are 2 things. First one being local philanthropy and community power. If USAID pullout can shake our whole system, then our system wasn't strong in the first place. So that's one thing that we have to reflect on as a sector. So real resilience from our side actually lies in local philanthropy, community trust, and partnerships that we build here at home. That foundation that we build from that, no international cut can take away. The second thing is resilience and courage. I like the fact that Audrey spoke about being calm and have clarity, but now I'm going to bring in courage. this moment actually calls us to take on courage, to be courageous, and to stay rooted in our purpose and why we exist as organizations. Courage to push back when donors demand a lot of things from us that don't fit into what we do. The courage to imagine new funding models that reflect our reality. In that way, when we frame everything in that way, we'll find ourselves in a space where we say, the cuts may shake us, but they won't break us.
Beautiful. Thanks, Nyasha. Louise?
Nyasha stole my point because I was going to talk about resilience, but I think that's very key at the moment, is building resilience to prepare for future crises. And what we're seeing and what foresight planning and future forecasting is showing, scenarios is showing, is that the crises will continue. They're going to escalate and they're going to be deeper. And there we need to, as organizations, whether we're funders or whether we are nonprofit organization, implementation organizations, we need to prepare for crisis. We need to build resilience for it. And we need to be able to deal with uncertainty. We need to look at uncertainty and change, embrace it, look at it with a positive lens, with an opportunity lens, rather than a fearful lens, because it's here to stay. And until we change the way we view and change an uncertainty and how we deal with it, we're not going to be able to have the impact we want to have.
Ladies, powerful, powerful words from all of you. Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's conversation. A huge thank you to our guests, Audrey, Louise, and Nyasha, for sharing your time and invaluable insights with us. This episode was brought to you by #Nonprofit, with the support of the LV and Ivy Middleton Charitable Trust, whose contribution makes this work possible. If you found this discussion helpful, please share it with your networks and keep an eye out for future episodes where we'll continue to explore the big questions facing our sector. Until next time, take care and thank you for all that you do.